All right, this video is about art documentation techniques and practices, and there isn't necessarily a right or a wrong way to document your artwork, but there are a lot of small considerations that add up towards creating great image quality. So we'll think about things on a scale of good, better, best, and we'll work with whatever equipment and conditions happen to be available, and we'll be mindful in doing so to achieve the best possible results. Depending on what kind of art or design you make, you may need to do a little bit more beyond the documentation itself to establish the context of your work. So these are all important considerations and more for art documentation.
First and foremost, documentation will allow you to create a portfolio of your work, which you can use in an online capacity in a website portfolio. You could use it in a BFA or MFA application or something similar, a juried exhibition, and you could use it for different kinds of artistic proposals. Your documentation may also be useful in creating a social media presence, which will help establish you as an active artist. Art documentation is also a means of gaining a better understanding of your own artwork and artistic progression, as you will be spending quite a bit of time with your artwork while documenting it. I tend to think if you spent that much time making your artwork, you should spend just as much time looking at it and thinking about it. Perhaps there are formal or conceptual themes present in your work that may not be obvious just by looking at a single image. Perhaps looking at all of your images will help you understand just what it is that you do a little better. Art documentation is also a way of gaining a better understanding of the tools that are important to your art making practice, such as cameras, scanners, and the image editing software that you are going to need to improve the images after you capture them. Perhaps the most important lesson to be learned about art documentation is do not procrastinate. Have your equipment readily available so it is not difficult for you to document your artwork effectively. Before you capture an image of your artwork for any purpose, spend a few moments considering the documentation conditions that will result in images of higher quality, regardless of the equipment you happen to be using. Work with whatever you have. Remember, good, better, best. We can always hope to improve our art documentation equipment, but this shouldn't hold us back from actually doing the documentation itself. In the act of doing, you will actually improve upon the techniques that are really important for capturing good documentation images. Consider working with friends or family. You may achieve greater results working in collaboration with others. Furthermore, you may be able to share resources working together on such a project. When deciding what kind of device to use for capturing images of your artwork, you're probably choosing between using a scanner or a camera. Depending on the media of your work, one may be a better choice over the other. Certain media will not scan well with some scanners. You should also consider whether your artwork might damage or dirty the scanner. Photography may yield better results if color is a major component of the work. Photography may also be necessary if the artwork is too large to fit into a scanning bed. When working with a scanner, be sure to set the scanner's settings to at least 300 dpi. This will allow you to print reproductions of your artwork at scale if necessary. You can always make a file smaller, but you can never make a file larger without affecting the resolution of the image. It may also be a good idea to use the color setting even when you are scanning a black and white or grayscale image. Sometimes scanner settings have a way of simplifying an image which may not be ideal in terms of the best representation of your artwork. You can also scan artworks that are larger than your scanner bed. To do so, you will need to tile the images together in Photoshop. It's also worth noting that scanning can be useful in the creation of new ideas or works. Play around with the scanning and image editing of your artwork. You might arrive at new ideas that you wouldn't have come to if you were simply approaching them with traditional media. Or perhaps reworking your images in a digital format might be helpful in creating promotional images for your work and your studio practice. Unless your artwork is smaller or perhaps more graphic in nature, photography might actually be the best approach to documenting your artwork. When working with a camera, you are likely to be working with a digital camera. Every digital camera will have the following adjustable settings. ISO should be set to the lowest possible option. This might be 50 or 100. Color temperature may be set to the appropriate lighting conditions. You can also adjust the file size of your image capture. You should select the largest file size possible for art documentation circumstances. Many digital cameras and some cell phone cameras will have a countdown timer. This is very helpful in taking clear images of your work, especially in conjunction with a tripod. Color temperature in photography relates very closely with the Kelvin scale, which is a method of describing the warmth or coolness in the color characteristics of a light source. The scale works opposite to what might be intuitive, with warmer colors occupying a lower number on the scale and cooler colors occupying a higher number. When creating your own custom lighting conditions for art documentation, it is actually better to use warmer light for this purpose, so light that is lower on the Kelvin scale. Your camera can adjust to these lighting conditions, whereas light that is brighter and higher on the Kelvin scale may actually burn out important details in your artwork. Ultimately, it is more important that your artwork is evenly lit rather than focusing on the intensity of the light. If you've ever taken a photograph and it appeared unusually cool or unusually warm, that may be because of white balancing or the lack thereof. Such a color temperature may not be obvious through our human eyes because our brains happen to process this information as immediately as we see it. It's almost as if our brains have an autocolor or autotone function like you might see on an image processor that is automatically being applied to what we see. Most cameras will have a fluorescent white balance setting to accommodate cool light situations, and will have a tungsten white balance setting to accommodate warm light situations. Your digital camera may have a different name for white balancing or may use its own kind of toggle for managing the color temperature. If you can account for the color temperature of your lighting situation while you're taking the photograph, this will yield a more accurate color representation of your artwork, and less editing will be necessary later on to achieve desirable results. One tool that may be especially useful for art documentation is the 18% gray card. This card is a perfectly neutral 18% gray, and if you don't have access to one of these cards, a white sheet of paper could work, but just be aware that what you think is a white sheet of paper may not be a perfectly neutral white, so just keep that in mind when editing later. The gray card will be used as a key in the image editing process, in particular with Adobe Lightroom. This is especially useful when doing batch editing in a single lighting circumstance. To benefit from this tool, be sure to take one photograph with your 18% gray card or sheet of paper somewhere in the image area of one of your artworks in the lighting context that you are documenting your entire batch of work. While not completely necessary in the art documentation editing process, doing this will allow you to remove human error from the white balance process. If you are doing white balancing for a large number of portfolio images, it may be very difficult to achieve consistent results through this process. Without such an intervention, the color representation of your documentation may be off. Depending on what kind of artwork you make, you may want to consider investing in a DSLR camera. Such a device would allow you to define light and space to a greater degree in your own documentation. This may be important if you make sculptural or installation-based work, or if you happen to make artwork in which the surface is sensitive to lighting conditions. Even if you don't have a DSLR camera, definitely do check through your current digital camera's features because it might have some of these controls that can benefit your documentation. ISO, for instance, is available on pretty much every digital camera, and as mentioned before, a low ISO is ideal for a well-lit artwork to be documented. A higher ISO setting is better at defining space within a lower light setting. The image quality of a high ISO image is compromised and usually tends to be grainy. Aperture is another DSLR function which controls the width of the camera opening, or f-stop. This allows more or less light to enter the camera, also defining depth of space. You can use aperture to differentiate your foreground and background in your images. You might choose a low or a high f-stop because you are trying to define either a small object or perhaps a large installation. In addition to depth of space, aperture will allow you to adjust your camera to current lighting conditions. Shutter speed is another DSLR control that allows for the speed of the camera shutter, allowing more or less light to enter the camera, and also defining motion and movement in an image. Shutter speed can be used like aperture to adjust to current lighting conditions. The two controls can be used together to achieve a greater range of defining light and space. DSLR cameras also have a light sensor. The camera is able to detect how much light is defining the subject. This makes the previously mentioned controls very easy to use. DSLR cameras also allow for RAW file formatting. This will allow greater possibilities when editing the images. You will have greater control over the color and the value present in your documentation if you are editing with RAW files. If you don't have a DSLR camera, then that's okay. You can achieve great results with whatever camera you have using best practices. One very worthy purchase would be a tripod. Even the most inexpensive tripod is a worthwhile investment. It will allow you to stabilize your camera over the course of a single or multiple photographs. Even better, if your digital camera has a countdown timer, you can use the two together to avoid holding or touching the camera at the time of image capture. Doing so may reduce any blurriness that may be present in the resulting documentation images. If you are working without a tripod, consider your center of gravity. Think about your body as the tripod. You may gain a little more stability if you lean back while taking the photo. Lighting your artwork may be one of the most important aspects of art documentation. If using natural light, it would be best to use bright indirect light, morning light, or overcast light. Using full sunlight may result in losing detail or perhaps the colors of your documentation images being affected. For many artworks, it may be ideal to create an artificial lighting environment. This would probably be the most effective way of creating the most accurate representations of your art. It will also make the subsequent editing of your images much easier, given you are able to control a consistent lighting setting. To make your own lighting setup, evenly light artwork from two directions at 45-degree angles with lights that are the same temperature and intensity. Make sure the bulbs in both of your lights are the same kind of bulb. Your lights should be level or higher than the work you are documenting. Use a tripod to set up the camera perpendicular to the center of the artwork. If you are documenting 3D artwork, use an ironed cloth or a roll of paper to create a seamless background. Lines created by edges or corners will lessen the visual emphasis of your artwork. Black or white would work best as a background, as these values may influence the color of your artwork less than other colors would. If you don't have a background to use, you could try to work with the aperture of your camera setting if you are able to do so. Pay attention to your placement of your lights and camera. You will probably want to position them higher in relation to the artwork than you might for two-dimensional art documentation. You may need to adjust the angle of your lights in relation to your artwork to reveal the best aspects of your work. Consider if your work would benefit from a model or architecture to give it a sense of scale or context. This could apply to furniture, jewelry, textiles, or other kinds of installation work. If your artwork is particularly sensitive to lighting conditions, you may need to invest more effort into your lighting setup. It may be a good idea to invest in better lights, but you also may be able to filter light or reflect light onto your work to reveal the best results. When you have created ideal lighting conditions for documenting your artwork, you should document as much artwork as is possible in your given setting. It will be particularly easy to edit a batch of images taken in a particular lighting setting rather than a bunch of random images that you've collected over a longer period of time and in varying lighting conditions. I do recommend using Lightroom and Photoshop for image editing, but other free alternatives are also available. You may need to do a little bit of cleanup work, some white balancing, or perhaps some cropping to get your image into its final form. When creating documentation images, always create a master file that is saved at the largest possible size. From your master file, you can create smaller files as needed. Many image editors will allow you to play with a resample toggle in relation to image size and resolution. Understanding these settings will help you create high-resolution images at specific pixel dimensions. If you have any questions or would like to share your own art documentation tips and techniques, please do so in the comments below. Thanks for watching.